My name is Keta Dlamini, and I am an MPP student at the Kennedy School. I'm currently on leave from the South African Treasury Department, and my research interests are at the intersection of fiscal and energy policy. Over the summer, I worked with the Executive Director of the Belfer Center to help develop the Africa in Focus series. I'm therefore happy to welcome all of you to today's discussion, Climate, Conflict, and Food Security in Africa. This event is part of the Belfer Center's Africa in Focus series, a forum for the critical analysis of processes and policies from the continent and its engagement with the international community. The semester, our thematic focus is on African agency in international climate policy and energy geopolitics. Before we start the program, however, we'd be remiss not to acknowledge the sudden passing of the former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. We pay tribute to his legacy now. Among his many accomplishments, he was the director of the Belfer Center, a professor, and a mentor to many of us here at HKS. His legacy of public service and global engagement, founded on integrity, continues throughout the work at Belfer and the many students he inspired. As a reminder, while this discussion is public, the event's organizers prohibit any attendees, including journalists, from audio and visual recording or distributing parts or all of the event's program without prior written authorization. Be aware that the session is being recorded, that your image may appear in the recording, and that we may post this video to the Belfer Center's website. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our panel. Simeon Ehui, a national of Cote d'Ivoire, has been the World Bank's Regional Director for Sustainable Development for Africa since the 1st of July 2019, and more recently, Regional Director for the West and Central Africa region since the 1st of July 2020, covering agriculture, environment, social, water, urban, and climate. His main responsibility, amongst other things, is to provide vision, coherence, and focus for sustainable development in West and Central Africa, consistent with the regional and country strategies. Before his current assignment, Simeon was director for the World Bank's Food and Agriculture Global Practice from 2017 to 2019. Since joining the World Bank in 2003, Simeon has held several assignments. He was manager of the Food and Agriculture Global Practice for Africa from 2015 to 2017, and South Asia from 2009 to 2015. Before joining the World Bank, Simeon worked for 15 years in the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, CGIAR. Simeon holds a master's and a PhD in agricultural economics from Purdue University in Indiana, and has published extensively in his field. He also holds a master's and bachelor's in economics from the National University of Cote d'Ivoire. Simeon is an honorary fellow of the African Agricultural Economists Association and a distinguished agricultural alumnus of Purdue University. Wanjira Mathai, who's on the call, is the Managing Director for Africa and Global Partnerships at the World Resources Institute, WRI. She formerly served as VP and Regional Director for Africa, co-chair of WRI's Global Restoration Council and senior advisor to the Global Restoration Initiative. She's also the current chair of the Mathai Foundation and the former chair of the Green Belt movement in Kenya. Wanjira has over 20 years of experience advocating for social and environmental change on both local and international platforms. Over the years, Wanjira has also served important strategic and advocacy roles, raising the prominence and visibility of global issues such as climate change, youth leadership, sustainable energy, and landscape restoration for women entrepreneurs in renewables, W-Power. The Mathai Foundation, WMF, and the Green Belt Movement, the organization her mother, Wangari Mathai, who was the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, was founded in 1977. Wanjira is one of a few 6 seconds EQ practitioners in Kenya and was named one of the 100 most influential African women in 2018, 2020, and 2021. Dhesigen Naidoo is currently climate adaptation lead to the South African Presidential Climate Commission and senior research associate leading the climate risk and human security program at the Institute for Security Studies, Africa. He is a leader, a scientist, and an activist for positive social change. He's also the president of the global NGO Human Right to Water and a founding member of the Water Policy Group. He was previously CEO of the Water Research Commission, South Africa's dedicated national water and sanitation innovation research and development agency for 10 years. He has previously served in senior positions in the South African national government and South African universities, having begun his career as a medical scientist in a specialist children's hospital. He's a counselor of the South African National Advisory Council on Innovation, NACI, and a fellow of the Makungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA. He counts his lovely wife and beautiful children as both his primary source of inspiration and the vanguard of his humility. This panel will be moderated by Professor Robert Paulberg. Professor Paulberg is an emeritus professor of political science at Wellesley College, an associate in the sustainability science program at the Harvard Kennedy School, and an associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center. He received his BA from Carleton College and a PhD in international relations from Harvard University. He's the author of 6 university press books and has been a member of the Board of Agricultural and Natural Resources at the National Research Council of the National Academies and the Board of Directors of Winrock International. He has been a consultant to the International Food Policy Research Institute, USAID, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the Aspen Institute, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He recently chaired the Independent Steering Committee for CGIAR Research Program, Agriculture for Nutrition and Health, A4NH, and is a member of the Food and National Security Task Force at the Bipartisan Policy Center. On a half-dozen occasions, he has testified to Congress. His latest book, titled Resetting the Table, Straight Talk About the Food We Grow and Eat, was published in 2021 by Alfred A. Knopf. Professor Paulberg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ketha, for the kind introduction. Welcome to my star quality panel today, and also welcome to our online audience to this discussion of climate conflict and food security in Africa. This is an important moment to be addressing these topics. You're probably all aware that we are moving into what is likely to be a very serious famine in Somalia, where the rains have failed 4 times in succession, and there's fear that a 5th failure is now underway. As a result, 7 million people in Somalia are in need of food assistance, and 250,000 are currently living under famine-like conditions. And Somalia is not the only difficult case in Africa right now. The United Nations also lists Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sudan, South Sudan, DRC, the Central African Republic, Kenya, and the Sahel region as areas of high concern. Nor is Africa the only part of the world that's experiencing difficulties. The UN also points to food emergencies now in Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan, not to mention Pakistan, which has recently been inundated by floodwaters. So this question is there a larger pattern here? And among UN officials and journalists and many others, it's routine now to say, well, the problem here is the combination of climate change, conflict, and COVID. These are referred to as the 3 C's. And I would like, as my first question to the panelists, I'd like to ask them in their work in the problems that they see. How well does this 3Cs formula hold up? Is it an adequate explanation for what's going on? Which of these 3Cs is the most important in their view? And how might this vision of the problem be corrected or amended? And let me start with Simeon Ehui. Over to Simeon. And I think you're on mute. Okay, good.
Oh, sorry about that. I just want to say thank you to you and to the organizers of this conference. And you, Rob, it's really a pleasure to meet you in person, having known your own dad. So it's really a good opportunity. And just let me say that I just ordered 2 of your books just now from Amazon. The 221 and then the other one that you published some time ago. Look, your question about the 3 Cs is very important. And let me say that conflict and climate change are among the key drivers of food insecurity in Africa. One of the third drivers, of course, the economic shock. But conflict and climate are really key, and I would like to talk about them. So let's start with the climate change, which increased food insecurity significantly, simply by rising temperature and increasingly frequent and severe weather extremes are reducing agricultural productivity. As many of you might know already, if we have a 3 degree Celsius warming trajectory, it will have catastrophic disruption in the impact on African food system over the next 30 years. For example, under a 3 degree Celsius warming scenario, Africa is expected to lose up to 30% of current growing areas for maize and 60% for beans by 2050. This is threatening. And what's happening is that many more, 1 million of Africans will suffer hunger. The second is that climate change increases food insecurity indirectly by interacting, with the conflict in a more complex way. So how is this happening? Let me illustrate a bit. Many conflicts hit rural communities hardest by damaging and destroying infrastructure. They damage infrastructure, they damage crop, livestock. Therefore, the economic impact of conflict on the agricultural sector, particularly on women and ladies, young girls, and women herders, is becoming increasingly large. It reduces the ability of household to purchase food. Okay, so in concrete terms, crop and are often lost as farmers are forced out of their field and food supply chains are interrupted. Now, on top of that, the climate change and conflict interact in complex ways. So the climate change tends to make conflict more probable because it increases the competition for natural resource and by influencing how people engage with armed insurgent groups, particularly where conflict resolving institutions are absent or dysfunctional. Simultaneously, what we see is that traditional mechanisms to cope with climate variability, such as the seasonal and circular migration, as you see with the pastoralists, for example, are impeded by the conflict, causing because the conflict itself is causing or it's a restricted movement of the farmers or the herders. So what's happening is that you have pastoralists or herdsmen that are not moving and are staying from migrating into the greener grassland, and then therefore creating conflict between them and the crop farmers. And this is what we are seeing in West Africa, for example. In Nigeria, you must have heard about fight between the pastoralists and the crop farmers in Benue State, for example, or in a country like Benin or Cote d'Ivoire. It's happening. It's all about how climate is leading to conflict. Okay, so to sum up, investments into food system supporting climate adaptation of the agro sector in conflict-prone areas can help to reduce conflict over resource access and increase food security in these areas in the medium term. And these are the type of things that we are working on at the World Bank, supporting countries to adapt to the situation when the natural resources become very scarce. Over to you, Rob.
Wonderful, Simeon. Thanks for that excellent analysis. It sounds like you're focusing on two of the C's, climate and conflict, less so today, at least, than in the past for COVID. So I'll ask now, Dhesigen, what things look like from South Africa.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks for that really detailed answer, Simeon. Let me add a few dimensions to that. Firstly, interpreting that first C on COVID. COVID has been one of the most powerful shocks to the global economy in the last little while, without a doubt. In fact, it's hard to see, and we hope that there won't be an equivalent going into the future. One of the most important things it's done, though, it's removed the fig leaf and has really exposed the vulnerability of the world order, and of infrastructure and systems. I mean, its impact has been extreme on the economy. It's an obvious health crisis. It's become a huge psychological crisis in the world. It is a sociological crisis of note. And the thing it has exposed, maybe most of all, in the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, when he did the Mandela Lecture in South Africa, was exposing perhaps the greatest pandemic the world has to deal with today, and that's inequality. So as a driver and as an exposer of our vulnerability, it has been extraordinarily powerful. Climate and conflict are really the ones that we want to engage with great detail. So I'm going to follow in the line of Simeon. Firstly, to say that on climate, I mean, Africa is extraordinarily vulnerable to climate. And it's ironic, of course, because this high vulnerability index that Africa has comes in spite of the fact that it contributes very little to the global greenhouse gases. It's less than 4%. And ironically, the countries in the world that have the lower vulnerability index, the higher adaptive index, are in fact the high emitters because they are the richer economies in the world. And we have to deal with this paradox. But we are drawing increasingly from the scientific evidence now provided by places like the IPCC, in particular, the Working Group 2 report from the 6th assessment, which has come out at the end of last year, which is telling us that there is a clear explanation for why we are experiencing the extreme weather that we are in many parts of the world. And that is because we're already at 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. Secondly, there are no quanta that I've been waiting for. Every incremental change in global average temperature has a direct impact almost immediately on extreme weather and vulnerability all around the world. On the African continent, something else raises its head as well in a very serious way, and that's the issue around climate refugees and new human mobility, migration on the back of climate change. And this has become an incredible phenomenon. From Simeon's own organization, the World Bank produced the Groundswell report, which says that by 2050, 89 million Africans will be intra-African climate migration products. They will be climate refugees, and they want to revise this number upwards. It's a very, very serious issue. But the conflict issue is rising in various ways. I mean, the big conversation on the continent right now is around non-constitutional, unconstitutional changes of government, coup d'etats, and we've had a plethora of them in recent times, have been enormously disruptive and distracting. And the link to the roots around a changing climate are becoming increasingly obvious. So much so that the AU Peace and Security Council in its November 2021 meeting last year met under the banner of the Climate Development Security Nexus, asking us to go much, much deeper into this issue and analyze its implications, because what we need to do on the back of this is to organize for a much better development pathway, not only to deal with the vagaries of climate change as they are now. I mean, you talked about a couple of countries, and we would add to that the Horn. We would add to that the intense vulnerability of Southern Africa to extreme high energy storms and other extreme weather events. I'm talking from a country that has both had a severe flood in a major city, Etequini, in April as part of a rain bomb event that happened around the world. And at the same time, we have another major metropolitan region, Nelson Mandela Metro, that is currently in drought. So these extremities and the link to conflict and the link to violent extremism and dealing with shocks that COVID has introduced to us makes the CCC a very important formula to look at. Let me pause there.
Well, thank you very much for connecting so many dots, Dhesigen. Appreciate it. And you added another concern, an important concern, and that's migration, which is a concern within Africa and also beyond Africa. But let me try to add maybe yet another C to the list, and that's constraints on water availability. When I look at the Africa of 1970, there were 365 million Africans. The Africa of today, 1.4 billion Africans. So the population has quadrupled in the last half century, but the endowment of water has scarcely changed at all. So per capita water availability in Africa has plummeted. Is it possible that this by itself can explain some of the struggles with adequate food production in Africa? Would we have food crisis in Africa even without climate change, simply because of difficulty in accessing enough water for residential and for urban and industrial use and agricultural use all at the same time? Let me ask, we can start with either one of our guests that wants to jump in. Simeon, I saw that you lit up on the screen there for a second.
Okay, yeah. All right. Look, Rob, the issue of water, there are two ways of looking at the water issue in Africa, in my view. So you have the water scarce areas like the Sahel, for example, where rainfall is very limited, where irrigation, all form of irrigation will be needed to be able to grow the crops. And then you have the other countries where actually water is abundant, like the Congo Basin, for example, Cameroon, the forest area. But again, where despite abundance of water, there's water scarcity, and I'll explain why. Okay, so For the Saharan, countries, the groundwater, according to study that we are working on, is not really a problem. Sometimes it's a question of being able to access the groundwater and make the good use of it, but also, of course, insufficient irrigation management of water, which is a major concern. Now, the large scale type of irrigation that we have seen in the area of South Asia, for example, can be very, very expensive. I think in the case of Africa, it could be like $10,000 per hectare to be able to do that. But we can have irrigation access to farmers by having the small scale type of irrigation, even what we call in our jargon here, farmer-led irrigation systems to make the resources available to farmers. So we at the World Bank are supporting countries in managing their irrigation. We have cases where we support for large-scale irrigation for making water available downstream, like in Nigeria or Cameroon, and also we are also supporting small-scale type of irrigations for farmers. A big problem sometimes is also on the policy area, where we think that a lack of appropriate policies for management of water is a major constraint. One policy constraint, for example, is land tenure. I can give you an example of an irrigation project. It's a regional irrigation project in West Africa called it's an acronym, French acronym that comes to my mind, but it is a regional irrigation program involving the 5 countries of the Sahel. And in Mauritania, we had an operation that was going on to make surface water available to people that we call beneficiaries. But last year or 2 years ago, we caught some other people writing to the World Bank president, complaining and saying that they are being dispossessed of their land by the World Bank because we are supporting people who don't own the land. I tell you, it led to a serious, the World Bank actually stopping the operation until we sorted out. We figured that we did not do our due diligence properly, because what was happening was that you had, if you know the story of Mauritania, in the, I think, 80s, there was a war, not a war, a conflict between the Arab Mauritanian and the Black, Mauritanians, and many of them were sent to Senegal, okay? And they resolved this issue, but they came back. But when they came back, their land were taken by the Arab, Mauritanian, and they established themselves. And basically, what I'm saying by that is that until we solve that land tenure problem, that irrigation program was not going forward. So we are now dialoguing with the government and say, look, we need to solve this problem. You need to take it by the bullet now, and then address the land tenure issue. So policy is a major constraint. Of course, the water is being impacted also on climate change because of the scarcity and so on. So at this moment also, we're also trying to see how we can take advantage of the rivers that are there to make resources available, water resources available to people. Now that is on the side of the Sahel. I mentioned the Congo Basin, for example, where water is not a problem, availability, but water access is a problem, okay? Because of the fact that people are not able to have a good management system to actually get this water from where it is to them. Okay, so we have, for example, issues of management of the drainage system, make the water, flow to the people and so on. So we have a situation where you have abundant water, and then people have no access to it. And then you have a situation of scarcity of water, and then people have no access to it because of the type of technology that's not appropriate or because of policy constraint. And at the World Bank, we try to work on all those fronts together with the governments. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Simeon. And Dhesigen, water scarcity made headlines in the Republic of South Africa not too many years ago. So you have an up close personal encounter with this crisis. Give us your thoughts about long-term prospects and solutions.
Right, for sure. Let me build on what's been said already, and I'll refer to some examples from South Africa. But the first thing to understand is that water is a constraint, but so is energy, so is access to finance for development, and so is market access. And all of these factors play large in the domain of the impact on our food security inside the system. And I think for far too long, we have had very narrow sectoral views on this issue. And it is time for us to develop our nexus strategies to engage these matters. Because you have highly successful water prosperous countries like Singapore, for example, because of their very small collecting surface that actually have a much lower water availability than many parts of Africa. So it's about how you manage what you have that becomes absolutely critical. The second big component that I want to put into the discussion is the whole issue around appreciating the international nature of the water availability that we have on the continent. I mean, I come from a country where 60% of the surface water is in international waters. It's in international rivers. More than 40% of our larger aquifers, our more significant aquifers, are shared aquifers with neighboring countries. So having very solid both basin agreements and other water cooperation agreements around these matters becomes absolutely critical. But I also have to point out that there's a combination of supply side measures and demand side measures that have to work in tandem. And one of the things that we have to be engaging much more strongly all around the world, and our recent drought episodes, including looming day zeros in many parts of the country, and these are not gone just yet, we are in prolonged drought episodes, is pointing to the fact that if you don't have very smart demand side management around a resource like water, you're actually not going to have enough water for development. And I'm talking about agricultural development, for food security, but also for economic development, for broader industrialization and economic development. And this is something that we're pushing quite strongly. And the third thing associated with that is that we have to catch up with the technological cutting edge, because the technology does exist for us to be able to manage our water much smarter than we do now. But we do have to have the right kind of financial resources to be able to do it. And then the last point I want to put on the table is that we have to accept there's a global liability around this. And let me talk about two things associated with that. One is the issue of climate change. So this continent, which contributes very little to the problems that we currently have around the world with regards to greenhouse gases, sans countries like South Africa. South Africa is the 13th largest emitter in the world, actually. But the other African countries certainly are not. We're carrying a burden that actually should be paid for by the North to some degree. And we're hopeful that COP27 is going to land that kind of deal, not only for Africa, but for much of the developing world, that adaptation to this new climatic condition requires a lot of financing, and that financing really has to be a shared burden. The second is that we have the possibility of a demographic dividend on the African continent. This will, in fact, by 2050, be the most populous continent on Earth. And it's a very youthful population, while most of the world is actually aging. So the world's future is coming from Africa. And the big question for the world is that, are you going to allow this to drift into a de-development demographic burden, because it can easily be that, or can we collectively work around managing things like our water resources, our energy security measures, so that we can get to the higher food security levels that we want to, and actually have a demographic dividend to the world? Robert, I think I should pause there because we're joined by our other panelists, and I'm sure she'll have a lot to contribute.
Wonderful, thank you, Dhesigen. And yes, we're joined by Wanjira Mathai, who had technical problems at first, but she's overcome them, and we welcome her to the discussion. I should mention, Wanjira, we started with a look at the 3 C's: COVID, conflict, climate explanation for food security crises in Africa today. And let me give you a chance to say a little bit about your work and what your perspective tells you about these 3 C's, which is most important from your vantage point.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad I muscled through these technology issues, but what an important topic. And I'm really glad to have come in, as Dhesigen was saying what he was, because, you know, that is at the heart of the matter. The 3 C's are quickly followed by a big crisis in food and fuel. So you can follow that with some F's. And it is really crucial because we have a growing population in Africa. And so if we think we have a challenge now in terms of demand for food, demand for land, a clear global land squeeze, but Africa being the fastest growing population, all of these will just simply compound the situation. And we must underscore the justice issue, because underlying all of this is a vulnerability that is driven by poverty. And that vulnerability driven by poverty demands that there is economic growth that requires significant investments. And a lot of those investments have to be made in a way that's clean and climate resilient, precisely for the reasons that have already been mentioned. But I just want to mention the fact that it is, especially for food, not only is food production one of the biggest culprits for climate, in the sense that we have at least 3 gases emitted in the process of food production: nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. But we also have a situation where food production is resulting in a lot of waste, and so we are not even able to feed everyone we can. And then, of course, we have a situation where a growing population will have an even greater demand on food. So at WRI, at the World Resources Institute, where I work, we have an emerging paradigm that I love. It is about how we produce food and produce more food, feed, and fiber on existing agricultural land more productively and definitely more nutritious, because what we have right now is not only a deficit in food fiber, but we also have a deficit in nutrition. And then, of course, that we protect the remaining natural forests. The protection of forests is central to how we move forward. The cushioning that we get from forests, the ecosystem services that we draw, agriculture that still relies largely on rainfall, that for many people who know the situation in the Horn right now, 5 consecutive failed rains. We have a drought that is the worst in 40 years. And so we have to protect the remaining natural ecosystems. And many of you will have heard the big discussions around the peatlands of Central Africa, and of course the great mighty tropical forests, crucial for all of us. And then we must then be willing as a global community to pay to keep them there. And so what are some of the mechanisms that will ensure that these countries that host these critical tropical forests protect them for us and for posterity? We also then have to reduce projected growth in demand for land intensive food and goods. And so that is, and then finally restore. We have forests, we have landscapes that are largely degraded. In Africa, the largest restoration potential. We have to restore what is left. So the paradigm: produce, protect, reduce, restore. Over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you, Wanjira. You've given us the 2 P's, the 2 R's, a couple of F's on top of the 3 C's. It's an alphabet soup, but it's a compelling agenda. And thank you for mentioning the link between a continued expansion of low yield farming and loss of forests, loss of habitat, destruction of the environment. Absolutely, it's a serious problem. But let me return for a moment to one of the C's. We hear a lot about conflict within Africa, but the world is now watching a serious conflict beyond Africa in Ukraine. And there are concerns that this might be worsening food crisis problems on the continent because Ukraine and Russia together were the source of 30% of the world's exports of wheat. Wheat's a very important food staple crop, especially in North Africa. Is this connection as serious as some people say? A lot of African countries only import a little bit of wheat, and it's mostly for urban consumers who want croissants with their coffee. It's not really a food staple in much of Africa. And I saw that just recently, Egypt, which is heavily dependent upon imports of wheat, including from Russia and Ukraine, is still able to purchase. They had their biggest purchase ever in June from other European suppliers and even from Russia. From Africa's vantage point, is the Ukraine crisis a part of your food crisis?
Absolutely. I think the Ukraine crisis is part of everybody's food crisis. We all woke up to the reality that we all depend on Ukraine, the global food basket. But I think the biggest story here is our own food systems and how our food systems are structured, how supply chains are structured, and that we need to shorten supply chains. That was the lesson from COVID. It's clearly the lesson from Ukraine. We have a situation right now, at least in Africa, where a majority of our food is produced by small-scale farmers who eke a living, the poorest in the world, many of whom are the hungriest in the world. There's something wrong with our food systems, and we need serious food systems transformation at that level of smallholder farmers, and then of course to trigger value chains that bring real economic prosperity for these farmers and of course across the value chain. One of the biggest tragedies of our trading systems is that we trade very little. Intra-Africa trade is historically very low. It's at 15%. If you look at Europe, 80% of trade is within Europe. Asia, 60% of trade is intra-Asian. We have got to increase intra-Africa trade. There's a lot of opportunity there for shortening supply chains for food and increasing intra-Africa trade and of course economic prosperity. So I take all this as a huge lesson for us as Africans, that we increase our own supply chain. We make them more efficient. Of course, there are huge trade barriers and reasons why this is the case. But I think Ukraine has taught us that, COVID taught us that. Hopefully we don't wait for another letter of the alphabet to teach us the same thing. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It is up to our leaders now to activate that and take it extremely seriously as part of securing. It is part of building resilience. When you cannot access food, it's hugely problematic. We've got to be able to rely on supply chains that are much closer to us.
Thank you very much.
If I can, sorry, I just want to add to that just a little bit. I know we want to make some time for the Q&A. I just want to add, I mean, I think that's really solid, what Wanjira has put through. I just want to point out that the limited exports from as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war is part of the story. The bigger part of the story is the readjustment of the global order and how people are reacting to that war and taking names, if you like, on the African continent. And what Wanjira puts out is exactly the way we need to go. The question is, will we be allowed to move in that direction? because there is a much bigger issue about whether or not Africa is going to be allowed to be a global player, or is going to be pushed back into the spectrum of being both a proxy, a playground, if you like, for a global conflict on the one hand, and being a pawn on the other. And this is a really, really serious issue, because if the world was sincere about us having the kind of self-sufficiency that we clearly can have, because we can have it, then very different kinds of support mechanisms need to come into play, and very different reactions to the conflicts need to come into play. And I just want to put that out there, that it's not just about the imports. It is about much, much, much more than that. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Just briefly, I think because of thanks to the Ukraine Russia war, the African leaders have woken up to address a critical issue. For example, the issue of fertilizer access. We immediately saw that a lot of countries were dependent on Russia or Ukraine for the importation of fertilizer. So with this war, immediately all the supply chains were disrupted. And just 2-3 weeks ago, we had an event here at the World Bank with the president of Togo being present, coming because of availability of the phosphate rocks in his country, together with the Office Sheriff and the Phosphate in Morocco, which is producing one of the largest producers of fertilizer, to try to examine how Africa could actually scale up its own fertilizer production. And we're moving in that direction. And I think that, I would like to agree with my two other colleague panelists, Wanjira and Dhesigen, on that, because it's not so much about self-sufficiency as such. No, I don't think that's the goal, but it's actually creating the opportunity for African farmers to have access to fertilizers that's domestically produced, but not just on supply side, but an opportunity for policymakers to actually look at the demand side. For example, the infrastructure, the road, the research and technology that can allow access, to fertilizer by farmers and have a very good return. And I think it is a blessing in disguise, and I do hope that the policymakers will really seize this opportunity to revamp the agricultural sector in the countries. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. We've opened up the Q&A function here, and I see some hands already up. We're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to suggest that the questioners go one after another. Keep your questions very short. Remember to unmute yourself, and then we'll give our panelists one final chance to pick and choose among the questions to the ones that they want to briefly answer. So we'll start with Thomas O'Donnell.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My question, as briefly as I can ask it, relates to recent information I've come across regarding international food companies' desire to strengthen their supply chains. And I'm specifically thinking about Nestle's corporation and their coffee, and even more specifically about their commitment in Côte d'Ivoire to help small farmers advance their crop capabilities for coffee. So in that context, Côte d'Ivoire, as well as the ability of international food corporations to funnel, really literally hundreds of millions of dollars in to help with this situation. What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. We'll now ask David Jed Schwartz.
Thanks. I got into the seminar a little late. I'm sorry, I missed it. So I missed 10 minutes or so. The question is, are there imminent famines presently happening in Africa, or are there any on the horizon? Are there instances of small farmers in Africa getting undersold by Western corporate agribusiness imports into Africa? And how many of the purchases of imports food imports into Africa are purchased with local currencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Holly Stevens has her hand up.
Hi, hopefully my Zoom is working. Thank you guys so much for being with us. I'm wondering if you could speak to, you've talked a little bit about like the global north and donor countries and international organizations supporting African initiatives on climate, et cetera. I'm wondering, especially as the US has started to pour a lot of money recently into food security in Africa. The Ukraine aid bills and supplemental bills actually included billions of dollars for food security, and most of which is being used in Africa. I think it's about 10 billion. I'm wondering, could you speak to what you think the most important policies are that should be implemented, or the things that should be funded? I know people are talking about short term in terms of famine or famine-like conditions, but then also thinking about the long term and shoring up local supply chains and food security. If you could speak to what you think US policy or other donor actors policies should be to support African nations on climate and food security, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can't resist jumping in here to say a little bit about the contrast between the United States and China in response to Africa's food crisis on the Horn. The United States has so far put $700 million into humanitarian relief on the Horn of Africa, and China, as of a couple months ago at least, had only contributed 34 million. So China thinks it wants to be a big player in Africa. It's got to do a better job of stepping up when it comes to humanitarian relief. But now I'm going to hand it over to my three panelists and let them pick and choose among the questions and answer those that interest them. I'll start with Wanjira.
I need to unmute myself. Well, thank you. Those are all great questions. And I think I'll just focus on the fact that one of the biggest opportunities in this time of vulnerability, when we need to build resilience of local communities, is to work to ensure that local farmers have got access to food, to seed, to inputs, so that they can do what they know how to do best, which is produce food and ensure their own food security first, and then of course engage in trade. That also means ensuring that they can consolidate. The cooperative movement has been very successful in coffee and tea and cash crops. How about we make it work really well in food crops? And I think that is one great opportunity, that we can activate food value chains across our country so that farmers can begin to benefit. One of the biggest risks, however, is we are starting to see, and the Africa Small Scale Farmers Association, AFSA, has continued to raise awareness about the fact that ensuring that communities can build resilience is also about seed sovereignty and ensuring that they can actually save their seed as they always have. But we've started to see efforts and policy that starts to curb that starts to ensure that farmers are relegated to buying seed from large corporates. I think that's criminal at a time when we're trying to build resilience at a local level. That farmers, and we saw this happening across India, that farmers will require at a time like this to build their own family food security at a family level, even as we build food security as a community. I'll close by saying this, Robert. This is about solidarity. It's about solidarity across the world. So often, even as we go into COP, we talk about the fact that the North is largely responsible for what's going on with climate, and the burden is theirs. And that's a fact. It's not a feeling. But we do have to also remember that the South supports the North greatly. The beef industry in the US dependent upon deforestation of the Amazon. We know that the technology industry in Europe is dependent upon the Congo Basin and minerals and mining there. And of course, palm oil in Indonesia and the food industry. So we are a global family and we have to start behaving like that. That's what I hope we'll find, that the solidarity that will emerge from a time like this will not be about finger pointing, but just about that we are to better, much better off together.
Okay, thank you, Wanjira. Very quickly to Simeon.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. 4 interesting questions. I'll try to answer a couple of them. On the areas where we see famine, for example, in West Africa and the Sahel, for the 3rd consecutive year, we have more than 38 million people that are projected to be in food crisis or worse. Not to mention what Rob you said about Somalia. And in the Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, more than 12.6 million people are affected by food insecurity, and about 1.4 million are facing food emergency. Now, in terms of response and what to do, I have to say that there's no single silver bullet. We need a whole food system approach, okay? And that will focus on adaptation option for food system, along the entire value chain. If we invest in adaptation for government, it will cost even much cheaper than investing in mitigation, because our data here at the World Bank show that the cost of adaptation action in Africa is about 15 billion between now and 2050, which is like 0.93% of their GDP, as opposed to the cost of inaction that can cost 200 billion, 12% of GDP between now and 2050. So basically what needs to be done, and borrowing the words of Wanjira on collegiality here, we need the coalition of all the donors and private sector, MDBs and Regional Development Bank and countries to help the country to produce less with more with less resources, which is like investment in climate smart type of innovations, which I think will be important. By that we mean innovation that enhance productivity, that enhance resilience, and also reduce emission at the same time. We also need to be able to help countries invest in digital solutions. We are today in the age of digital, and we can do a lot by scaling up the delivery of tailored agricultural services through digital means and help countries. And finally, we should not forget, the long-term solutions that will include investment in research and extension, land restoration, water management, which you mentioned, infrastructure support, and climate information services. A lot of those investments require resources. At this moment, Rob, African countries, if you look at the study by the scoring by the African Union, only a handful of countries are really investing 10% of their budget on agriculture. You can count them on the figures on my hand here. Most of them are not doing that, and so encouraging them to invest sufficient resources in agriculture from their own resources, and then having the development partner coming and support will change the landscape in African countries. Finally, I know we are running out of time. Someone asked questions about policies. I think we need to help countries repurpose their expenditures from wasteful type of expenditure to more public goods, and we can do like that. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Simeon. So Dhesigen, you get the last word here.
Yes, and very quickly. I don't want to hold people back too much. Firstly, on your comment about the US versus China, that requires a long conversation. And this is a vibrant discussion right now on the African continent, I can tell you. And there are many nuances that I think are important to ventilate and understand. But I want to talk to Holly's question about the things that are the high priority on the continent towards food security. I mean, one of those, and it's not happening, is an investment in the diversification of staples on the African continent. This is a really, really big deal. I mean, this is a continent that managed to be food secure for hundreds of thousands of years because it had a very diverse staples environment. So the monoculturing in recent times has been a major factor associated with food insecurity and vulnerability. The second is that we need to encourage many new entrants into the agricultural space. I mean, Africa, like other parts of the world, have the opportunity to have agriculture as a major driver, not just for survival, but also for global competitiveness. And we really need to engage that. And the thing that goes along with that, and the thing that we have very difficult discussions with the United States about, is market access. And that's something, you know, if you opening up that conversation would be invaluable to the African continent in a major way. There are far too many restrictions, and there are many opportunities that would be clearly beneficial to both the continent as well as the US. And then the last point I want to make is that all of these are energy intensive enterprises. So facilitating the energy security of this continent on a low carbon pathway is probably one of the best investments the world as a whole is going to make. If it gets Africa right, the world's going to be right. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And we are out of time. I feel though we're just getting started here, and I'd hope we could reconvene this group sometime to work our way through the rest of the alphabet. But this has been a stimulating discussion. I want to thank Wanjira and Simeon and Dhesigen and the organizers of this conference, including Khadija, for putting together such a stimulating event. And thanks to our audience and to our questioners, and we'll hope to stay in touch.